When lighting a background, what does it mean to have the reflector fall off equal the distance fall off? I'll tell you on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. Today's question comes from Darren B, and he wants to know, I was watching an old video featuring a talk from photographer Dean Collins. He was describing how to light a background from the side, and he said to let the reflector fall off equal the distance fall off. Can you explain what that means? Thanks, Darren, for sending that in. I do certainly appreciate it. And your question really brings back some great memories for me. If you've never heard of Dean Collins, he was a master of photography and specifically lighting back in the 1980s and 90s. He was a very successful commercial photographer, shooting products, cars, fashion, corporate photography, and so much more. I think he was based in Southern California. Now, Dean also did something that was not as common as it is today. He taught workshops, did speaking engagements, wrote photography books, and even released more than a few videos of photo lessons and demos. Remember, there was no YouTube back then and really no internet to speak of. Learning the technical aspects of photography was not as easy as just looking up an episode of, let's say, Ask David Bergman. You actually had to go to live meetings and events hosted by organizations like the ASMP if you were lucky enough to have a chapter in your town. But Dean's lessons came out on VHS tape, so they were accessible to almost everyone. I owned as many as I could find. He didn't hold back in his videos. He shared all of the tips and techniques that he had spent years perfecting. He really made you feel like you could do what he did, although that's easier said than done. Now, Dean was shooting medium and large format slide film and didn't have the exposure latitude or the immediate feedback that we have available today, but he was meticulous. He would build his own light modifiers from PVC pipe and diffusion material to get exactly the look that he wanted. I'll never forget a shoot that he did of a motorcycle in the studio. He used a long exposure and physically moved a background painting while slowly turning the wheels with fishing line to make it look like the bike was speeding down the road. He uses a lot of light and throws around terms like the specular to diffuse transfer. The guy really knew what he was talking about. Unfortunately, we lost him far too young. Dean Collins died of cancer in 2005 at 51 years old. Thankfully, we still have some of his videos to remember him and his amazing talent. If you Google around, you will find that you can buy digital versions of his old tapes, and there is some content still on YouTube as well. Now, as for Darren's question, in the video he referenced, Dean was talking about lighting a flat background in the studio. His full quote is actually this: "Your background light is going to be a strobe backed way up and then shotgunned across. Even though it's coming in from one side, I can get a very even illumination because I'm not going to aim it at the background. I'm going to shotgun and let the reflector fall off equal the distance fall off. Get the idea?" Yeah, sure, Dean. Absolutely. We get the idea. All right, so what is Dean actually talking about? First of all, he's using flash, but these techniques work with constant light as well, whether you're shooting stills or video. Also, this doesn't only apply to white backgrounds. It's just about getting an even spread of light across the entire thing, no matter what color you're using. Now, if you're trying to light a flat background with one light from the side, you need to understand how light travels. Every point on that background gets some amount of light, and that amount comes from two things. The first is how far that point is from the light, and the second is how strong the beam is in that direction. The distance part is just the inverse square law. Now, I've done videos about this before, but it simply means that if you double the distance from the light, the brightness doesn't get cut in half, it actually drops to 1/4 the amount of light. That's 2 stops darker. On a long, wide background, the near side is physically closer to the light than the far side. So just from distance alone, the near side is obviously going to be brighter, and the light falls off as it travels across the background. That's the distance fall off that Dean talks about. Now, I said the second part is how strong the beam of light is in any direction. We all generally use some type of light modifier on our strobes, and Dean was using a standard metal reflector. Now, no reflector is perfectly even. The center part of the light coming out of the reflector is the hot spot where the light is the brightest, and the outside of the beam is weaker as it gets cut off by the edges of the reflector. So if you had the light dead center on axis with the camera, the middle of the background would get the most light, and the reflector would cause the light to fall off as you measured it further away. Even if you weren't using a reflector and just shot bare bulb, the middle is still going to give you a hot spot. However, it usually makes more sense to use a reflector or some other type of light modifier so you can control the light and keep it from going all over the place. By the way, I am mostly talking about the light spreading left to right because in a normal horizontal frame, the background is usually wider than it is tall. Vertically, if you keep the light around the middle of the background and far enough back, the top and bottom are usually close enough in exposure that you're not going to notice a big difference. The big change is really just across the width from near side to far side. So now, in Dean's shoot, he's got the background light off to the side, but wanted to make it perfectly even across the entire frame. Remember, in those days, you had to really get everything right in camera because you didn't have the ease of digital post-processing like we do today. So he wanted to get the exact same amount of light hitting every inch of the background, even though the light was off to one side. Now, if you aim the light at the closer side, the near edge is both closer to the light and being hit by the hottest part of the beam. The far edge is further away and being hit by a weaker part of the beam, so it's taking a hit from both the distance and the reflector. So Dean's suggestion is to flip that around. You can put the light off to the side, but you aim the center of the beam towards the far side of the background. The far edge is much further away, so it should be darker because of the inverse square law, but now it's being hit by the very strongest part of the beam. The near edge is closer, so it should be brighter because of distance, but it's now only getting the edge of the beam at the side of the reflector where the light is weaker. Now, if you aim it just right, those two effects are going to cancel each other out. The loss from distance on the far side is balanced by the reflector being brighter in that direction, and the extra brightness from being closer on the near side is balanced by the reflector being dimmer at that angle. This is what Dean means by making the reflector falloff equal to the distance falloff. You're using the shape of the beam to fight the inverse square law and flatten things out across the background. Now, back in the day, this took some trial and error. It was best to use a light meter to measure the exact amount of light hitting the background. By slightly changing the angle of the beam, you could eventually get to a point where you had the exact same exposure all the way across that background, even measured in tenths of a stop. Before I go any further, by the way, I want to remind you that if you like these kinds of videos and have a question you want me to tackle, just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form on the site. I'm always looking for real-world questions that other photographers might be wondering about too, and I just might pick your question and answer on a future show. If you do want to keep in touch with me, I have a site of links to all of my social media, my free email list, all my videos, and some discount codes and affiliate links. You can find that at thedavidbergman.com, and it's all in there. Also, I would appreciate it if you take a second to hit that like button under this video, subscribe to the Adorama YouTube channel, and of course, hit that bell icon for notifications. It really helps us out and lets us keep producing free educational content for you every single week. All right, now Dean also suggests two other things to help get even lighting on the background. First, he says you should back the light up as much as possible. Again, because of that pesky inverse square law, by adding more distance to the equation, the difference in light hitting one side versus the other becomes much smaller. That helps lessen the change in brightness from one side to the other based on distance. Let me make up some numbers here. If the light was really close, let's say it's only 4 feet from the close edge of the background, it might be 12 feet to the other edge. That's a big distance change, and because brightness goes down with the square of the distance, the far side is getting a lot less light than the near side. However, if the light is 20 feet back, even though it's still off to one side, maybe it's 20 feet to the close edge and 24 feet to the far edge. Those distances are much closer together, so the fall off across the background is a lot gentler. Now, I'm not doing the real math here, but you get the gist. The amount of light fall off because of distance will be much less if the light is further back. Now, the other tip that Dean said in another part of the video was to use a longer lens. If you back up and use a longer focal length, you'll decrease your field of view and will be seeing a smaller area of the background in your photo than if you shot with a wide angle. At that point, all that matters is the amount of light hitting in your field of view, not the entire background. So it's a little easier to even it out in that smaller space. I told you, Dean was meticulous. His understanding of the laws of physics was insane. The good news is that we have more tools at our disposal than he did. As I mentioned earlier, digital has a lot of exposure latitude, so you don't have to necessarily get the light perfectly even across the whole frame to tenths of a stop. And having software like Photoshop makes it pretty easy to lighten and darken uneven areas to get the look that you want. Today, if I wanted to evenly light a background, I'd probably use 2 softboxes on either side. The light from softboxes tends to look more even across the frame than it does with a tight metal reflector, but it's still a bit brighter in the middle. I would aim them across to the opposite sides so the hotspots are balanced by the distance. Today, we actually would call this feathering the light. Think about an actual feather. It's solid and dense along the stem, and then it gets thinner and more delicate as you move out towards the edges. Light from a reflector or softbox behaves in a similar way. The character and intensity change as you move away from the brightest central part of the beam into that outer, more gradual area. In practice, when photographers talk about feathering, they usually mean they're taking advantage of that feathered part of the light instead of pointing the absolute hotspot straight at the subject or background. Dean's terminology is a bit old school, but it's still the same thing when he says to have the reflector fall off equal the distance fall off. The loss of light from the edge of the modifier at the near edge matches the gain from being closer, and the gain from the reflector at the far edge matches the loss from being further away. You're just using the shape of the beam to fight the inverse square law. Of course, you don't always need to have a solid, evenly lit background. By knowing how to accomplish that does make it easier to make it uneven when you want to. Understanding the laws of physics and how light travels also makes this a lot easier to do without any guessing. And I would argue that's a lot more fun. So Darren, I hope that explains it. What do you all think? Do you remember the late, great Dean Collins? Did he have an impact on your early photography like he did on mine? Let me know down in the comments below. To learn more about working with light in the studio, go ahead and check out a video I did recently about creating hard light when you're working in small spaces. Thanks so much for watching Adorama TV, and I'll see you next time right here on Ask David Bergman.